Good afternoon. Jessica and I are very honored to be here with you today and are hoping to share a little bit of our experience with self-regulation and play from the lessons we've learned from Tools of the Mind. Jessica and I both have come to Tools of the Mind as trainers right now, but before we were early childhood administrators and ran preschools and kindergarten programs. And before that, we were both teachers. So we were early childhood teachers, and I understand many of you are early childhood teachers as well. So we'd like to talk a little bit today about the notions of self-regulation and about play and how those go together, and talk about how they might impact what's happening in your classroom. In the United States, there's been about the last 10 years, there has been a lot of study and a lot of pressure on preschool teachers and kindergarten teachers to teach academics, to really focus heavily on reading and math skills and not very much on social development, not as much on the whole child approach. After 10 years of work and really pressure for us to be able to focus on academic skills, the research shows that all of that academic pressure has not prepared our children well for being academically successful when they're after the programs are done, after 1 or 2 years. The children still are not academically successful. And we think one of the reasons for that is that we're looking at the wrong things, that the foundational skills of self-regulation are what we need to be looking at, because that skill of self-regulation is what is a foundation for all future learning. So self-regulation, we talk about self-regulation, other people also call it executive functioning. It's associated with the prefrontal cortex, and it involves two different kinds of regulation. One is social emotional regulation, that is being able to delay gratification, be able to wait for something, being able to, like waiting for my chocolate at the end of the day. Anxiety, how do we control, regulate our anxiety, our emotions, and stress, either high stress or low stress, and anger. And also, the second piece of self-regulation has to do with regulating our cognitive behaviors. And those include attention, how do we pay attention, how do we remember things. The older I get, the more I appreciate working memory, and cognitive flexibility. How do we approach problems, how do we think about problem solving, and how do we come up with creative solutions. So those two pieces, the self-regulation of social emotional piece and the cognitive piece, go together and influence how children learn. So why do we focus on self-regulation? Well, there's some very powerful research that has been done in the United States that looks at self-regulation being a stronger predictor of school readiness than other measures. And that relates to both math skills and literacy skills. Also, when we're looking at self-regulation for older students, we know, at least in the United States, motivation and task engagement are very problematic. Sometimes our adolescents don't really want to be in school, don't want to really do school. And so they're not motivated to learn, they're not engaged in the learning that the teachers give them, and they're not motivated to be learners on their own. Self-regulation is the tool that gives people that option. And also, finally, in this one, we're talking about kids with if they have better regulation, they have higher levels of social competence. So if they can control their emotions, they're much more likely to have more friends. If they have more friends, then they interact more often with others and learn social skills and have higher levels of social skills. And we know that learning is a social activity to a great extent. So when you have shared activities and you have someone else to learn with, you learn better. Jessica and I have been learning a lot since we've been in Chile together. It's been a very good shared activity. Also, we would like to talk about the issue of stress and controlling stress and the affective functions of that impact how we learn in all kinds of situations. We know, for example, when you're learning a second language, I'm very aware of this right now, how my anxiety is a little higher when I'm in Spanish than when I'm in English, and it makes me nervous. Am I understanding? And so if I'm very nervous, maybe I don't understand as much. Maybe some of you that speak another language have had that experience. Also, that emotional regulation influences the teacher-child relationships. When I do workshops, I'll say, do you have a child who really is a challenge to you? Anyone? Anyone know that child? And the teachers all, yeah, they know that name, right? You know the name, right? And as teachers, as professionals, we're very challenged to be able to talk and to teach those children because we do a lot of interaction with them on behavior rather than on instruction and a lot of management and maybe not as much on direct instruction and scaffolding their learning. And so that really impacts how children learn. And the emotional regulation also, I mentioned, influences peer relations and how kids play together and how kids learn how to be friends and how they benefit from interactions with their peers. Some of the research that we've been looking at points to the fact that self-regulation, it seems that if we don't address self-regulation early, it is less amenable to later intervention. So early intervention is key. No one in this room doubts that early intervention is key, right? We all believe that starting with young children, we can have a profound effect on the outcomes, their educational outcomes. And not only educational outcomes, but also looking at antisocial behavior. And in the United States, school dropout, I'm not sure if that's an issue here, but it certainly is an issue in the United States that we have many, many, many children that drop out that are not successful in our school settings. And self-regulation is a huge piece of that. A study that was done in the United States, again, found that preschool teachers report that behavioral problems are their greatest challenge in the classroom. And I was a director of an early childhood program, a very big public early childhood program, and over the last 10 years, the number of preschool children that got kicked out, expelled from preschool to come to my preschool has quadrupled. It's an alarming number of children that are being identified in lots of settings where teachers can't handle them. Also, the kindergarten teachers report that less than 50% of their children start school in the United States with self-regulation skills. And they have to spend a long time at the beginning of the year to even develop systems that can work so their classrooms are places where children can learn. The development of self-regulation, however, is something that we can help. There's something we can do. We as teachers can facilitate the learning of self-regulation. It's not something that happens, that it comes naturally. Not everyone is self-regulated. If you think of some of the adults in your world, do you know anyone that's not self-regulated? No names, please. It's not a personality characteristic that can't be changed. So it really is something that is critical, not just to education, but also to society as a whole. If we have people, children, that can self-regulate, we will have a more productive society. And the convergence of evidence pointing to the fact that early childhood is the time when this happens is critical. It really, I want to tell you the story of the little girl. We're working in a project in Chicago with a little girl named Genesis. And when I saw her in August, that's our first, or September, when school starts, She was she was 3 years old, and she could not stay any place or do anything, couldn't sit in a chair for more than 5 seconds, 10 seconds, and I'm not kidding. 10 seconds was the longest. And if a teacher came to try to help her, nope, she didn't need to listen to that person either. She really had very limited experiences of anybody controlling her effectively. And so I went back about 2 weeks ago to see Genesis, and I almost cried. It was one of those moments where you just think, this is amazing. In Tools of the Mind, we work on play themes and play scenarios to develop self-regulation that Jessica is going to talk more about. But she was pretending to be in a beauty shop, and she was the customer. She was sitting for 8 minutes at least, getting her fingernails done and her hair fixed. She was engaged. She was paying attention to the children she was playing with. The children that she was playing with were telling her what to do. She had self-regulation. She was being other-regulated, but she let somebody do that. At the beginning of the year, she wouldn't even let a grown-up tell her anything. She would do whatever she wanted and went wherever she wanted in the room. So self-regulation was the key and when we talk about, I want to talk a little bit more about the elements of self-regulation: inhibitory control, working memory, and cognitive flexibility. Inhibitory control is first the ability to be able to stop and think before you act. And if you ever been, I don't know if you have class reunions where all your schoolmates come together every 10 years or whatever, and you haven't seen somebody, and maybe you saw somebody and they look like maybe they've gained a little weight, and that's what you think. And you say, oh, it's so great to see you. I've missed you. How have you been? You don't mention anything about what you're thinking, right? You control that. Another example of acting appropriately when you're tempted to do otherwise. I was in a classroom recently where there were 2 little boys sitting next to each other. And one little boy, and the teacher was teaching. And then one little boy was bored. He was not engaged in the task. And he started licking his finger and touching the other boy. And the other boy first looked at him and gave him a mean look. And he kept looking at the teacher, listening. Very good job. The little boy goes, Hazim goes, does it again. And he's like, okay, you're not going to pay attention to me? Let's do some more. And Jose looks at him and turns his back. And Hazim was very persistent. He has good persistent skills, and so he started doing it harder and more. And finally, Jose had enough, and he just pushed him. And so everybody has their limit. But watching him, I just was amazed at his ability to self-regulate and inhibit what was truly an impulse to hit somebody, I am sure. But he managed to control himself. And paying attention, the third one is paying attention despite distractions. And I only have 2 words to say: cell phone. I know that I argue with my daughter about that quite frequently, about that issue in our house.
How about Facebook?
Facebook, yeah, there's another very good example. Why is it important to be able to use inhibition? Because in order to follow rules, you need to be able to have some self-discipline. And I was talking to someone yesterday who was explaining the metro system in Santiago, and how not everybody follows the rules on how you board, apparently. And because they thought that was a good example where people didn't necessarily use self-regulation here. Another part of inhibitory control has to do with your social decision-making, problem-solving. So when preschool kids want a toy, they first would grab for it, right? That's their impulse, is to grab for it. But if they have inhibitory control, if they have self-regulation, they can think about, I can either grab for it, or maybe I can ask, can I have it when you're done? And in that way, children obviously have better social relationships and have better opportunities for higher level of interactions. Working memory is the second component of self-regulation, and it helps you hold information in your mind while you're working mentally and updating it. Working memory is the gateway to long-term information. So when first you have to keep the information in your head, and then it'll go in your short-term memory, and then it'll go into your long-term memory. And it is critical in our ability to see connections between seemingly unconnected things, and hence creativity and imagination. And a lot of times, if you think about children reading, and we're often asking them to make text-to-self connections, think about something you know about this and relate it back to some experience you've had. You see how important it is for academic skills as well. So that ability to use your working memory to understand a story, to be able to pay attention to directions, to be able to decode long words. I was in a room the other day where this little girl was doing dinosaurio, decoding it, and she was going very slowly. And I thought, oh, she's not going to remember all that. And she took a minute, and she looked at me and goes, dinosaurio. And she was so proud, and so was I. She did such a good word. And her working memory obviously was a strength for her. The third component of self-regulation has to do with cognitive flexibility, and that is being intentional about being able to switch your perspectives or your focus of attention. And one of the examples I like to use with people that know two languages is if I say, what is this? You can tell me it's a table, or you could say it's una mesa, right? That we know that. It doesn't matter. We understand tableness, that tables are made of wood and glass, and we find them in different places, and we use them for different purposes. We have a concept of table, and we can, if we are speaking to somebody that speaks Spanish, we can use mesa, and we can use English and say table, and it doesn't change the tableness. So we can be cognitively flexible in our understanding of linguistics. And it also refers to the ability to change how much intensity or how much work the demand of a certain kind of a task is. And I think about the task of reading a research project or a research paper on Vygotsky compared to reading your newspaper. You have to pay a lot more attention to that than if you're reading the Vygotsky article than the newspaper, right? And cognitive flexibility is important because our children are growing up in an era when it is critical for them to be good problem solvers, being able to think out of the box. As Catherine mentioned, the Facebook people, Zuckerman, everybody that created that Facebook concept, are a perfect example of people really thinking out of the box. And so that's a skill that our children are going to need desperately in order to be effective and successful adults. So executive functioning is required when you're not on automatic pilot. If you think about when you're driving to work or you're taking the metro or the bus to work, and it's the way you always go, and have you ever had those days where you get to work and you go, oh, I don't even remember how I got there, right? You're on automatic. But if you're trying to find a new school you've never been to or go to somebody's house you've never been to, even if you have your GPS, you're paying attention to what's going on, and you're having to spend a lot more energy thinking about how to get from one place to the other. That's what executive functioning does for you. And Jessica now will talk about self-regulation from the Vygotskyan perspective and talk about the application of that within an early childhood context.